Hello. So in this video, I want to talk about what we should make of Philia in a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. So this is a thing that I've experienced a number of times, right? When you're involved in a theatrical production and you're going through the rehearsal process and you're saying your lines over and over again, you're hearing other people say their lines over and over again, you're studying the lines, etc., etc. You pick up on things that on a first read, you might not. And one of the things that I've picked up on is that Philia is in a sort of weird position. So her role within Forum is basically she is the ingenue. She is the young, attractive love interest, hero's love interest in this case. And the plot more or less revolves around getting them together over a number of obstacles, right? So that's the sort of broad basis of who she is. But there's a couple of things that are quirky, we'll say. So one is her claim that she doesn't drink wine because her religion on Crete forbids it. Now, that's a plot device, right? Pseudolus and, to a lesser extent, Hysterium come up with an attempt to execute this plan where basically they're going to give her a sleeping potion in wine so that she will appear dead, so that Miles Gloriosus will abandon his pursuit of her, so that Philia can go with Hero, right? Okay. To the best of my knowledge, there was never a religion on Crete that forbade the drinking of wine. It wasn't a thing. In the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, in ancient Rome, there were not religions, or at least any sort of mainstream, major, substantive religion that forbade the drinking of wine. Quite the opposite in most cases. Wine was very, very typically incorporated into religious rituals. And wine drinking was pervasive throughout the Greco-Roman world. So this doesn't historically make that much sense, but it's a relatively minor thing for me because it has a clear plot purpose, right? It's obvious what its role is. It is to create this additional roadblock in Pseudolus's plan to get Hero and Philia together. So good enough. I accept it on a plot level. But the other thing that she says that I don't know is a problem, but it's a strange thing for me. She has a whole song about how basically she has never been taught anything except to be beautiful and graceful, etc., etc. And the reason that this is interesting to me is because it is framed very much in terms of they teach us. So whoever it is that has trained her to be a courtesan teaches the courtesans in general this. But that's a very sort of pointed statement when we think about the sort of economies of sex work and slavery and I'm going to use the term companionship for a pointed reason that I'll talk about in just a little bit within the Greco-Roman world, because it is somewhat strange in this instance. Now, to the extent that Philia is the airheaded virgin ingenue female love interest, I'm totally fine with that, right? She is a stock character, as is everybody in Forum, and in the plays of Plautus, on which Forum is loosely based, as well as the sort of larger genre of Greek New Comedy, Roman Comedy, Commedia dell'arte, and their inheritors, often the young lovers are not that bright, right? Often both the young male lover and the young female lover, they have heads like a walnut, basically, right? Like nothing is getting in there. So that's fine. But again, it is very specifically set up in terms of they teach us. It is a collective pronoun. Now, I'm not a specialist in this, but I did actually do some research on this for a chapter in my dissertation / first book. And there were different classes of what we would today probably broadly call sex workers in the Greco-Roman world. And this distinction sort of existed in other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Like there are words in Hebrew for these sort of different classes of sex workers that indicate roughly the same kinds of divisions that that some of the terms, especially in Greek, reflect. So, and I know the terms in Greek best, and I think they carry over. I think they kind of get borrowed into Latin and get slightly modified, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So, broadly speaking, there's sort of three classes of sex workers in the Greco-Roman world. There's the pornai, who are they're just sort of straightforward sex workers, right? They are the people that you go to for one reason and one reason only. Streetwalkers, I guess. That's probably not a very complimentary term, but basically, right, I think they are what we generally sort of culturally think of today in the modern West as prostitutes. They sell sex, and that is what they do, right? That is really primarily the extent of their services. And to be honest, I actually have no idea if that's the extent of the services offered by modern prostitutes. I have no idea. I've done a little bit of research on it for actually a different article that I wrote, but it's not something that I know a tremendous amount about. So there's the pornai. They're the sort of typically lowest status sex workers in the Greco-Roman world. Then you have courtesans, which is what Marcus Lycus's girls are called in the play. And so the only reason that I don't sort of take that at its word is that I don't think that Gelbert, Shevelov, and Sondheim were really sort of digging into the intricacies of ancient Greco-Roman sex work to find the proper term. I think they were finding a term that people in the modern West would recognize. So again, I'm not saying that this is the wrong term. It probably is, but I'm interested in it because of what the vicissitudes of this play, the questions that the vicissitudes of this play raise about ancient sex work. So courtesans in the Greco-Roman world were sort of broad band of people. There's probably a sort of gray area between the sort of upper echelons of the pornai and the lower echelons of the courtesans. And then I would say probably a much wider gray area with the upper echelons of courtesans and the lower echelons of what are called the hetarii, or hetarii. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it because I've heard it pronounced different ways. But so courtesans are not just sex workers, right? They are more like entertainers / sex workers. So the idea that they are not taught anything other than to be beautiful is probably not entirely accurately reflective of the training of a courtesan. And this is slightly difficult, I think, to talk about because there's such a wide band of them, right? So some probably are closer to the level and the services of the porni, where they are primarily hired for sex, but others are much more educated, sophisticated, intelligent, multi-skilled, right? So courtesans probably would have at least a basic, if not a well-developed knowledge of singing, of different musical instruments. They would be able to dance. And of course, the courtesans of Marcus Lycus do sing. Well, they dance. We don't see them sing except in choral parts. But at one point, Lycus does say the girls will sing and dance for the entertainment of Miles Gloriosus, right? So clearly they have training in this. And like the idea of striking vocational poses, like they clearly have training, right? It's not necessarily clear that like the porni would have much training for what they did. Some probably did, but probably many of them were in sort of desperate financial situations and were driven into sex work because there were just not that many options for particularly single women without families, and maybe without proper citizenship status within the polis that they resided in. There were just not that many opportunities to make a living. And this, of course, has been one of the main drivers of sex work for women throughout history, right? But the courtesans would have a degree of training, of education, because while they generally would be expected to have sex with clients, they also were expected to entertain in a sort of non-sexual way, right? Songs, dances, poetry, recitations, things like this, right? And again, because there's such a wide sort of band of people for whom this label might be the right one, it's hard to say what the skill level was, right? You sort of imagine that there was wide variation in terms of like how good they were, how good an individual was at singing, how good an individual was at various musical instruments, how well they could recite poetry, whatever it was, right? How well they could do these things that were the foundations of Greco-Roman entertainment at like banquets and feasts and, I don't know, house parties, whatever it is, right? And then there is the hetaerai, the sort of upper echelons. And this is where the term sex worker may become slightly inaccurate, because there is, I think, some disagreement about whether the hetaerai were actually sex workers as such, whether or not they were hired for sex. Some people, and I think I think sex was probably part of it, in part because the Greco-Roman culture did not have the same sexual hang-ups that modern Western culture, influenced by centuries of Christian, theoretically, asceticism and sexual purity rules had, right? Sex was not looked at the same way in the ancient world as it is in the modern West, with the inheritance of Judeo-Christian anti-sexuality, right? So I think probably sex was part of what the hetaerai did, but it was not the main thing that they did. You did not go and hire a hetaerai, hetaira, I think would be the singular. But you did not go and hire someone of this profession because you wanted sex. That was not the purpose of them. Companions is probably a much better way of thinking about it. So these women were highly educated. In addition to knowing things like music, singing, poetry, they would be skilled conversationalists. They would know philosophy. They would keep abreast of politics. And basically, you would go and hire a hetaira. I'm not sure. I'm probably fucking this up. And I apologize. So you would go and hire one of the hetairai and bring them to your feast or your symposium or whatever it was, your literary salon, to borrow a term from 18th century France, right? You go and bring this person, and they would provide entertainment, but the entertainment was like philosophical debates, political discussions, music and art, etc., etc. And so it wasn't like this was a person who was being hired primarily for their body. It was a person who was being hired primarily for their mind. And there is a slightly sort of patronizing element to this, where I think there probably was a sort of degree of like, oh, here's a woman who can talk philosophy. What a novelty. Ha ha ha, we're patriarchal motherfuckers, right? I think there probably was that sort of condescending element to it of like, oh, this is a woman who is exceptional because she can talk politics and philosophy. In the same way that, like, you think about, say, the history of African Americans in North America, this sort of periodic sort of holding up of a person like Phyllis Wheatley, for instance, or George Washington Carver, or someone like this, and being like, oh, look, here's an exceptional person of African descent. What a novelty. All the rest are dumb, but this person happens to be unusually intelligent. Ha ha ha. What fun for us, the people in the dominant side of the social hierarchy. And I think there probably was something quite similar with the hetairai. This sort of sense of like, and I don't want to sort of overly broadly paint the Greco-Roman world in terms of gender relations, but generally speaking, these are patriarchal cultures, patriarchal societies. And so I do think there probably was an element of like, most women are dumb and need to just stay in the house and shut up and have babies, but this woman can talk about the ideas of Socrates and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and whatever, right? And there's this sort of like tokenism to it. And so it's an interesting thing, right? Because so to pull it back slightly to Forum, I don't think it makes that much sense at the level of like, here's what a courtesan as such actually does in the Greco-Roman world. I don't think it makes that much sense for Philia to say they do not teach us anything. Again, maybe the courtesan trainers determined that she was never going to outwit Sherlock Holmes, and they just sort of said, listen, you just stand there and look pretty. We'll teach the rest of the courtesans some stuff. Although Philia herself does sing and dance. So clearly she does have training. But it is interesting, this sort of question of like, what did sex workers in the ancient world know? What were they trained to do? What was their role in their societies, etc., etc.? These are interesting questions, in part because I do think it was a very different sort of economy of sex work than, maybe this is overly broad, but than what we in the modern West tend to picture as sex work, which I think we typically assume is not particularly intellectual, whereas in the Greco-Roman world, there was definitely an intellectual component to a lot of sex work.